Hey guys, it's Mish here from Leaf Life Sydney. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the basics of Anthurium pollination and what to do if your Anthurium starts to flower. So let's start with the basics. If you've got amazing, bright, indirect light, great humidity, a beautiful free draining soil mix, you're watering like a boss, and you're feeding your plants on the regular, it's only a matter of time before it produces one for you. An inflorescence starts out by growing out of the inside of an existing leaf petiole, which is sometimes mistakenly referred to as the stem. Not right? Because inflorescences grow out of an existing leaf petiole, I've learnt you should never cut off old damaged leaves just because they're ugly. Inflorescences can still happily pop out of a damaged leaf, so stay away from the scissors. As long as the leaf can still photosynthesize, you should never cut it off, as you are essentially killing off a potential inflorescence. I was personally chopping ugly leaves off for quite a long time because I'm a bit of a perfectionist, but what I didn't realise is that I was missing out on a lot of chances at pollination. So all this talk about inflorescences, what exactly is an inflorescence? Here's the technical definition. The Anthurium flower comprises of an inflorescence, which is the spadix, enclosed by a modified leaf, which is the spathe, borne on a long stalk, which is the peduncle. The inflorescence produces bisexual flowers, which means they have male and female structures. The flowers are contained in dense spirals on the spadix. After it's fully grown out of the petiole of the plant, the spathe will unfurl and expose the spadix. A few days later, the first phase you'll see occur on your inflorescence is the female anthesis stage, where it will exude watery-like droplets called stigmatic fluid. In the wild, there's often a scent or even pheromones associated with this stage to attract pollinators. In this case, you're the pollinator. Depending on the conditions, maturity, and likely loads of other factors, this female phase can vary, but it tends to last a couple of days up to a few weeks. The stigmatic fluid will start at the bottom of the inflorescence and slowly move its way up towards the tip of the spadix. Sometimes though, it may not make it all the way up. After this phase is finished, the fluid will dry up and begin the second phase, which is the male anthesis stage. This is where the pollen starts to pop out of the same tiny parts of the inflorescence where the stigmatic fluid came out. So, to recap, it starts out as a female and it changes to a male. How amazing is that? So let's talk about self-pollination and storing pollen. If you're wanting to self-pollinate your Anthurium, you will need to collect pollen from the first inflorescence and store it for the next one it produces. To store your pollen, your best bet is to freeze the pollen you've collected so it stays as fresh as possible. You can do this by using a paintbrush to brush the fresh pollen straight onto a sheet of aluminium foil. Once you're done, fold it over, label it and date it, and trust me, your future self will thank you for that one, and put the whole thing, including the paintbrush, into a Ziploc bag. Before I pop it in the freezer, I also like to throw in some silica beads into the Ziploc bag to extract any moisture from inside the bag. You can find your very own silica beads inside those little sachets you get when you order clothes online. The ones that say, throw away, do not eat. Throw a few of those in, and as they say in Australia, Bob's your uncle. I usually collect the pollen once a day for a few weeks until it stops, and I pop the bag back into the freezer after each collection. When frozen, pollen can stay viable for anywhere between a few months up to about a year. Once you've stored your pollen, and when the next inflorescence has grown out, in the receptive female phase, you can use your stored pollen and the same paintbrush to self-pollinate the same plant. It's best to do this early in the morning, as this is when it's highly receptive, but really you can do this any time of day. I would recommend rubbing it with pollen every day until the stigmatic fluid dries up. It can be a bit of a balancing act on deciding how long to wait for the female phase to make its way up the spadix before you pollinate, as usually when you add the pollen to the spadix, it stops producing the stigmatic fluid and moving further up the spadix. On the other hand, if you wait too long for the female receptive phase to go a little bit further up, sometimes you may miss the window altogether, as it doesn't always go up to halfway, let alone the tip. So just keep in mind, only the part of the spadix that has the stigmatic fluid when you're pollinating is the part that will have berries in future. So let's talk about cross-pollination. Sometimes very different looking anthuriums from within the same genus can be crossed, but usually plants from different sections will not cross. For example, Clarinervium and Veitchii. If you happen to have another anthurium that has an inflorescence at the receptive female stage, at the same time that your other inflorescence is producing pollen in the male phase, you may be able to cross-pollinate these to create a hybrid. To do this, you can just brush your finger over the pollen from the first inflorescence and straight onto the receiving inflorescence. You'll know you've been successful with your pollination when you notice a little change in the spadix. You'll notice that it starts to form a grid-like pattern and start to swell just a tiny bit. Something important to note at this point is that after you coat the inflorescence with pollen at its receptive female phase, and it was successfully pollinated, it can still go onto the male phase to produce pollen. I wish I had known this a few years back, as I was cutting inflorescences off left, right and centre after the pollen had dried up, thinking it didn't take to the pollen it was given, but it could have actually worked, as I had later learned. If your anthurium has been successfully pollinated, you need to give yourself a great big pat on the back. Pollination takes a lot of patience, so well done on getting this far. In this next phase, the inflorescence will slowly start to form little berries in the same spots that the stigmatic fluid and pollen came out of. This is the point where the inflorescence changes into what's called an infructescence, which essentially just means it has little fruits. It usually takes a few months for the berries to develop. When they're ready, they'll pop out of the infructescence and you can easily pick these off. Most of the time you will get 2 seeds in each berry, but sometimes you might only get 1. After you've popped the berries off, you'll need to squeeze the seed out from inside the berry by popping it between your fingers. I like to rinse the seeds off in water to make sure I remove all of the berry flesh before I plant them, as this flesh can cause the seed to rot. There are a few different ways to grow anthuriums from seed, but in my personal experience, I've found the best rate of germination is growing in sphagnum moss. It may not be the fastest method, but it's certainly been the most reliable for me. I use a large container with a lid and damp sphagnum moss on the inside. I place the seeds on top with about a 10 centimeter gap between to allow a bit of space for them to grow as seedlings. I pop the container on top of a heat mat with a folded towel in between to lower the temperature slightly. A heat mat is also optional if you live in a warmer climate, but I'd probably recommend it if you're in Sydney or Melbourne or in the cooler months of the year. For fastest germination, you'll want the seeds to be in the range of 21 degrees Celsius, but to never let it exceed 30 degrees. Somewhere around the middle of this range is perfect. Now this is important. If you don't allow a buffer between the container and the heat mat, it will cook your seeds. So just make sure it's in a warm, slightly warm environment, but not too hot. In terms of seed maintenance, every day I take the lid off each container for a bit to allow the excess moisture in the container to evaporate slightly, as well as allow the seeds to breathe in an effort to prevent fungal and rot issues. Before you put the lid back on, give the seeds a good misting with a spray bottle to make sure they stay moist. Now, depending on the conditions, the seeds should begin germination in about 5 to 7 days, but it can also take up to a couple of weeks. So there you have it. You should now be armed with all the information you need to achieve Anthurium pollination at home. Thanks for watching. See you next time.